Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to the Microgrid Roadmap webinar. I'm just going to wait a few moments while we allow a few more people to join us. Maybe while we're waiting, if you want to just pop in the chat where you're joining us from, that'd be great to see whether we're just a Victorian audience or maybe further afield. So feel free to pop that in the chat. So I think we might get started. So thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Karen and I'm the Engagement Manager at Monash with the Net Zero Initiative. So this webinar is the 6th in the series run by the Monash Energy Institute and the Net Zero Initiative. The webinar will run for an hour. We'll have about 30 minutes of presentations from our 3 panellists, and then we'll have 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A. So feel free to post your questions into the Q&A section during the webinar, and we will address them at the end. And you'll also have an opportunity to ask questions in person as well. Just so you know, this webinar is being recorded and it'll be available live under the Net Zero webinar page. And you can access all of our other recordings as well from our other webinars, so feel free to view those. Before we start, I'd like to recognise that we're meeting on the lands of the traditional people. I'm coming to you from Melbourne, so in my case it's the 𝗗𝘗𝗲𝗻𝗄 tribe, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and express a warm welcome to anyone who is joining us today. So as the world looks to address the challenge of climate change, we need solutions to achieve net zero emissions. So our energy system is transforming and we need new tools to support this. Today, we're going to be talking about microgrids as an enabler for net zero. Now, interestingly, microgrids have existed for some time. In fact, you might not know, but the first microgrid was developed in 1882 by Thomas Edison. And amazingly, Edison's Manhattan Pearl Street station met all of today's criteria for what is defined as a microgrid system. So these are not new systems. But as our energy landscape is changing and we move from a centralised to a decentralised energy system, the opportunity for microgrids is actually growing. And as part of the Net Zero Initiative, Monash has developed a microgrid at the Clayton campus. And we've been able to test and research an urban microgrid at the precinct scale. And an important part of the Net Zero Initiative is to share our learnings, which is what we intend to do. It's the aim of our session today. So presenting, we have Scott Ferraro, who's the Director of the Net Zero Initiative at Monash. We have Craig Chambers, who's the Managing Director at Engevity. And we have Céline Klemm, who is a Research Fellow at the BehaviourWorks Australia organisation. The panel will talk you through what a microgrid is, how you use it, and what you need to know if you plan to develop a microgrid. We'll also explore the opportunities for microgrids in Victoria and share insights into the user experience. So we'll start with Scott, who will take you through the microgrid toolbox. Scott is a leader in net zero emission strategy development and implementation with a deep understanding of the opportunities to reduce emissions across energy, transport and building sectors. Scott and his team, which I'm part of, are focused on transitioning the Monash's Australian operations to net zero emissions by 2030 and also finding translatable solutions to enable the broader transition to net zero emissions. So welcome, Scott.
Thanks, Karen, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Very happy to be talking you through the findings we've had and the toolbox we've developed as part of the work, the Net Zero Initiative here at Monash, and in particular, the work out of the Microgrid Electricity Market Operator project that received funding support from 𝗗𝗲𝗻𝗀 through the Microgrid Demonstration Initiative as well. We've been talking with a number of you on this call as we've been going on this journey. And I guess what I'm going to give you an overview today is really what's in the toolbox that we've developed, just to really as a resource based on the journey we've been through and that we continue to go through. And really it's there to help people understand what that journey looks like to develop a microgrid, the role it can play in achieving net zero, and how you can go on that journey yourself as well. I guess a really important thing to note is it's a start. It's not meant to be the panacea for you to be able to pick up and go off and develop your own microgrid. It's meant to give you some hints and tips based on what we've learned, and we'll be continuing to add to this over time. So really would appreciate thoughts and feedback as well on what you want to see as we try and help others on this journey. So I guess some broad context of microgrids for Monash. This is a photo of our Clayton campus located in southeast Melbourne. And I guess the story here is that Monash is an operator of precincts and cities. So this campus itself, pre-pandemic, really has a population of about 50,000 people who turn up each day, staff, students, researchers, industry partners, and the like. And it is a mini city. It's quite a large site. Monash itself is committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2030, and for us that really means shifting to 100% renewables and decarbonising the energy we use for our buildings. And so what we've been looking to do for a microgrid is how we get control over the assets that we've got to help us achieve net zero, and how we can really integrate those with the electricity market. For us, it's really about reducing energy costs and increasing uptake of renewables, but also trying to do this in a way that demonstrates to others what these solutions can look like. And I appreciate that the definition of a microgrid is different to different people. We can look at microgrids as being totally off-site, remote, islanded from the grid type setups. We can also look at microgrids which are connected to the grid, which are capable of islanding. And then in our instance, we look at a microgrid in terms of how a precinct like this can engage and interact with the grid. And we're not aiming to island ourselves. So I guess we've got a range of assets that are connected to the microgrid we're developing, which covers about a third of the Clayton campus. So there's 20 buildings in total. There's about 1 megawatt of solar PV. There's 1 megawatt hour of battery storage, and we've also got EV charging infrastructure as well. So for us, we've really looked at how do we integrate all these assets, and how do we get them to respond to both internal and external signals to provide value to us, but to the grid more broadly as well. And so we've developed a model through the MIMO project where we look at a microgrid operator, so a way that you can actually coordinate and integrate these assets and these resources to access different value streams and revenue streams. And for us, this is really about a number of key services. So obviously being able to get access to that data across the site in terms of energy use and provide insights to help inform our decision making as we look to deploy more and more renewable assets on site and upgrade our buildings and electrify our plant as well. And then a number of key services for us around managing our peak demand charges, looking at demand response, both in terms of responding to signals from the wholesale market via our retailer, but also how we look to integrate our power purchase agreement for an off-site wind farm that we've got to help drive down our energy costs as well. And then how do we manage export limitations that we have with our connection agreement with our retailer. So based on the journey we've been on as we've developed this microgrid, we've tried to step back and look at what is the process that you actually need to go through to set up microgrids. And this might look familiar to a lot of you in terms of a pretty traditional process, and to be honest, it is. So we consider a microgrid as a piece of technology that can enable us to deliver that net zero journey, increase energy resilience, and also reduce energy costs as well. So there's a number of key steps that anyone would need to go through. And really, a lot of it is focused on the planning phase. So really understanding what the opportunity is and understanding your stakeholders' needs and requirements to help define, is a microgrid the right fit for you? What is it that you want to achieve as a community, as a business, or as a precinct more broadly, so that you can figure out if this technology is the solution you are looking for, and also inform the design as you work through these next steps. There's also steps around getting your data set up and access to data. Data is key to these systems. This is anywhere from understanding your existing data, the data on the network in which you are located, as well as deploying devices and structuring your data so you can really get access to it and then be able to do things with it. Obviously, a lot of people are at this stage of feasibility as well, so understanding what does the right microgrid control system look like, what are the benefits and the costs associated with it, so you can make an informed choice. And then the next step is really looking at how do you get to that investment ready. So how can you actually get the funding set up, so you can deliver a microgrid for your purposes. And this is looking at the governance structure, the finance structures, and assessing the contractual and legal and regulatory constraints you might work in. And then there's following steps around obviously implementing and operating the microgrid. So the toolbox we've developed, this is an interactive infographic on the toolbox where you can click on and get some more information about each step. But then it's also got resources based on our learnings today that can help you work through this journey as well. So for example, here at the identify opportunity step, we've really mapped out some of the key questions you want to be asking yourself or your stakeholders and how you might go about assessing whether a microgrid is right for you and fit for purpose. The same goes on the feasibility step. We've got some details around what you need to do and what you need, the things you need to be assessing during a feasibility study. But then we've also provided some information around the different microgrid models that are available, appreciating that microgrids themselves are really based on local context. So context of where you are within the distribution network, context of the relationship between different customers that might be on the microgrid, and what those drivers are for you as well. So there's further detail in these resources to help you work through. And then also on the investment readiness front, there's a lot of information in there around potential governance structures you might look at and questions you want to ask on that front, and then also the financing models and different structures you might have to set up for these systems. So where we're heading in this space at Monash is really looking at how can we help support people on this journey. We've learned a lot and we will continue to learn a lot as we go. A lot of the consultation we did through the Microgrid Demonstration Initiative project we run was really trying to assess where people are at and what support do they need. And we've really looked at sort of 4 functions in this space. So there's support needed to help people along this journey and to be able to both facilitate them through this journey, but provide those tools and resources to help people as they work along that microgrid development journey. We've recently received some funding from the federal government through their Regional and Remote Community Reliability Fund to help 6 communities across 3 Victorian LGAs through this phase to get to that investment readiness point. And we'll be working with Birdwood Energy to help support that process as well. Microgrid Commons is really looking at how can we develop some common resources and common materials, especially around the digital architecture and structure of these microgrid systems, to help people get a long way down this path themselves before they need to start customising for their own circumstances. The informed influence and convener is really thinking about how can we pull together the learnings across all these microgrid projects that are happening to help inform regulatory and policy reform that is currently underway, because regulatory barriers are a persistent issue with microgrid development as well. And then how do we build the peer-to-peer network between both microgrid customers, but microgrid developers and the various tech providers and service providers that are emerging in this space. And obviously, being a university, education and training are really key. So how do we build capacity within the customer base to understand the opportunity for microgrids and focus on professional development in this space as well. So I guess just to wrap up, this is a continuation of a journey for us. We've really invested time in understanding the role of microgrids and how we deploy them for ourselves. And now we're starting to look at how we support others. So we really would appreciate your thoughts and input. And there's a form on the website, on the toolbox, where you can go to express your interest. So as we start working up those professional development offerings and further resources as we continue to populate the toolbox, that we can make sure they reflect what you guys are actually needing out there to help you along this journey. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that, Scott. That was great to get an overview. So next we have Craig Chambers, and Craig will present on some of the opportunities for microgrids in Victoria. Craig has over 25 years of experience in the energy sector, and his background includes pioneering distributed and renewable energy innovation to founding a vertically integrated utility startup. In addition, Craig has led corporate strategy, stakeholder engagement, regulation and pricing for Australia's largest utility group. And Craig has also supported Monash over the last few years to consider its market entry strategy, this roadmap and regulatory reform consultations. So over to you, Craig.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks very much, and thanks for everyone and the Monash team for allowing me to present today. So as Karen said, we've helped Monash over the last few years, particularly around their 𝗗𝗲𝗻𝗻 funding obligations, to really explore microgrids in Victoria and where microgrids might be best suited within the Victorian region. And I'm trying to summarise in 10 minutes many months worth of work, so I'll do my best to whip through it. So I think just coming back to some of the things that Scott said, taking on a microgrid has multi-dimensions, whether you're looking at the regulatory context of licensing exemptions, metering, how your tariffs, if you are grid connected, are impacting the flexible resources on site, the customers on site and how those customers' assets may be used, the technical context of what control system you might use, creates a whole lot of complexity for microgrid developers. And you'll see in the next few slides there is a lot of activity, but I think this integrated consideration of microgrid has probably scared a few companies, developers, communities, and it's great to see Monash taking steps to help unpack that for developers. So I thought I'd start with just the PV market. So we hear a lot about the solar PV market, and I think it's interesting to highlight this as a trend and a precursor for where the microgrid market might go. So many of you would know, there's been a huge, almost tripling, quadrupling of the PV rooftop market over the last few years. Victoria's not far off in regards to the league of the states across Australia of installation rates, and many of the support programs that are ongoing in Victoria at the moment are going to drive a lot more acceleration of the solar market. But I think the interesting trend is the kind of middle top graph there is a growing size and scale of rooftop in the market, much more than what your general residential house can support, and a growing trend of commercial industrial businesses looking to put solar on their roofs. So if you look at this 𝗓𝗏 solar market in Victoria, there's 285 solar installations averaging about 310 kilowatts on roofs. If you put that in the scheme of the overall solar installed on roofs in Victoria, it's still relatively small. But this is the first of the graphs that I'll put up and maps that I'll put up. But you can see that a lot of concentration around Melbourne, but still a huge amount of C&I development across Victoria at the moment, which over time you would expect would get other devices, whether EV chargers or batteries, into those installations, and in time likely become nanogrids or microgrids in those precincts. So then what we did is we were asked to kind of look at what is the activity of microgrids in Victoria. And given microgrids aren't a defined term under the National Electricity Rules, it's hard to unpack where microgrids are. But one proxy is network license exemptions in Victoria. So what we did is we took the AER network license exemption register and we mapped those locations across Victoria. And as you can see, there's a huge amount of activity, almost 1,700 or just over 1,700 locations which have network license exemptions. Now, not all of these will be microgrids, but it does show the level of activity already in Victoria that in time will become microgrids. So just extending that theme further, what we did is looked at all the embedded network license exemptions across the NEM. And there has been a somewhat of a drop off over the last few years. I think we saw some peaks in 2017 and 2018, but Victoria almost has as many network licence exemptions as New South Wales. Queensland slightly more, but there's I think over 7,000 network licence exemptions across the NEM. So this isn't a small part of our energy system. This is a large and growing part of our energy system. And as I said before, these aren't all microgrids, but it is a proxy for the level of activity in the market, and probably shows a greater need for greater acknowledgement within the national electricity rules for these types of energy supply systems, not only to understand how and where they sit, but also to protect customers as this becomes a common way in which energy is provided. So what then we were asked to do is kind of look at where the optimal locations are in Victoria. So trying to find some perfect matches. So what we did is we looked at combining the network opportunity maps, which ENA and UTS have kindly developed on an annual basis, and looked at also where there might be large industry that might be interested in a microgrid. So the National Pollutant Inventory is a register that helps that we look to map against where there might be network deferral benefit, i.e. where there might be a good location for microgrids. Now, not all these sites will be suitable, but what we're trying to do is highlight the fact that where you can see a high polluting industry, a high energy intensive industry, and a high need for network investment, microgrids might be a useful augmentation solution for the energy system in Victoria. And a lot of network deferral benefit that could be yielded by these businesses over time in the form of microgrids or supporting the network. Another way to think about where microgrids might be a perfect match is looking at the reliability and resilience. So the right-hand side, the kind of 𝗗𝗏 graph there of Victoria, looks at where bushfires have been in Victoria. And what we did is we put a buffer zone around those bushfire zones. And many would know that severe weather events such as bushfires, major heat waves, are a cost pass-through for network businesses, and not necessarily a cost consideration in their planning in regards to how the network is configured. But this is a major concern for communities in these regions. So what we tried to do is, again, look at that perfect match where there's a reliability need, i.e. a network upgrade, where there is a community with a critical mass, say over 1,000 dwellings, and a significant amount of solar uptake, plus a resilience concern around bushfire risk. Now, this isn't perfect. Bushfires, where bushfires have been in the past, doesn't necessarily say this is where they're going to be in the future, but it is a consideration that we should be thinking about in regards to running transmission lines or distribution lines through national parks, which might be bushfire prone. So just to finish off, to reiterate, I think it's great to see Monash taking an initiative in regards to helping wrap around the many challenges for development of microgrids, much more than just solar. The integrated solution model, I think, will become more prevalent in the energy market. There are a number of challenges in understanding tariff impacts, your data, getting all the stakeholders on board, and it's great to see initiatives like this supporting communities and developments to better understand how they can use distributed assets. With that, I'll hand back to you, Karen. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Craig. That was really interesting, and interesting that I guess microgrids can be both a way to mitigate emissions, but also an adaptation for climate change. So that is really interesting. Thank you. Okay, so our final speaker is Céline Klemm. Céline will provide insights from our microgrid trials and share the user experience on building occupants. Céline is a behavioural scientist with experience working across diverse research projects in the area of environmental sustainability and human health. And her research investigates topics such as consumer choice for circular products, priority for behaviour change for climate adaptation, and how communication during a pandemic influences risk perception and preventive behaviours. So, and currently she's involved in looking at a project in the role of human behaviours in microgrids. So over to you, Céline.
Thanks, Karen, so much. And it's really an honour to be here today and to be presenting some of the research that myself and colleagues at BehaviourWorks Australia have done. And it's really great to see so many people attending today and to be able to share these learnings. So our study was really focused more on the psychology behind the experience and the acceptance of microgrid as a new technology. And we were particularly interested in the role of behaviours for the optimal performance of microgrids. And this is the method that we used. So in particular, the first three steps that you can see here, the rapid review, the interviews, and the behaviour prioritization, looked at key energy demand behaviours that are relevant for optimal functioning of microgrids more broadly. And then later on, we looked specifically at behaviours that were related to the heating and cooling control. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a little bit past these first three and talk about them only very briefly. And I really want to focus on the field trials that we conducted earlier this year to trial and intervention at Monash's Clayton campus. So we started off looking at the available evidence to understand what demand management behaviours are relevant if we want to support the optimal functioning of a microgrid. So who needs to do what differently, and also what interventions had already been tested in earlier studies. And we found that there is actually very little evidence on what works if you want to engage users in energy demand behaviour, so encouraging them to either reduce energy use or to shift it to different times in the day. And most studies were from remote or islanded microgrids, so completely off-grid and in a different context to a campus microgrid setting. And so this really showed the importance of conducting field trials to understand the experience and user behaviour. We then interviewed practitioners and experts to complement the evidence review and learn about examples of programs, initiatives, or interventions that were tested in the context of Australian microgrid settings. And the interviews mentioned a range of interesting interventions that they had trialed to engage users. So one was using incentives, typically financial incentives. Another one was giving feedback through quite sophisticated mechanisms using dashboards that were interactive or websites. And another technique that was mentioned was appealing to people's sense of social responsibility and leveraging this to encourage changes in behaviour. We then selected a priority behaviour to target in an intervention through discussion in a stakeholder dialogue and ranking them based on the likely impact of those interventions and the likely adoption or acceptance of these changes by users. And we've decided on an intervention that was focused on the control of heating and cooling systems. Heating and cooling systems have a really large potential for energy use savings and for the reduction of CO2 emissions. So now the part that I really want to talk about today is the field trials that we ran in collaboration with the Monash Net Zero team across a number of buildings at Monash Clayton campus. So our main goal with this was to understand the flexibility of either reducing or shifting demand that we could achieve if we use different HVAC control strategies, and then testing how these different strategies would influence building users' thermal comfort levels, so how comfortable they were with the room temperatures, and also their behavioural response. We tested two different control strategies that were designed and implemented by the Monash Net Zero team, and they looked at the socio-technical side of this, and then, the techno-economical side of this, and then we were interested in the social or the human side of this, so how the users were experiencing these changes. And as a secondary goal, we were also interested to understand the effectiveness of informing the users of these buildings of the changes and the difference in experience that they might be having using posters or on-site communication, as you quite commonly see in public places. So here's what we did. We first established the baseline measures by surveying staff and students that were using the selected buildings that were included in this trial on campus, asking them about how comfortable they were with the building temperatures as they were, whether they were accepting these temperatures going forward, and whether they were engaging in a range of different self-regulation activities. So, for example, putting on warmer clothing or using portable heaters to stay comfortable. And we asked this before we made any changes to the control of heating and cooling systems to see how they were feeling at baseline. And then we implemented the intervention across a period of 2 weeks in 8 buildings at Monash campus, making changes to the HVAC control. So in some buildings, we used a strategy that was widening the upper and lower temperature settings to a maximum of 2 degrees. So this allowed for greater fluctuations in temperature by either up to 2 degrees colder or 2 degrees warmer than usual. And in other buildings, we preheated or pre-cooled the buildings in advance of the normal heating and cooling requirements. But this also results in some changes to the room temperature, but at different times in the day. So, for example, it might be warmer in the morning. And then at the end of this period, we surveyed, again, staff and students that had been using the buildings during the trial period to understand their experiences. And this time, we also surveyed faculty service managers about whether they had observed any changes in occupant comfort, in their behaviours, had they received increased complaints, and whether they thought that these changes were appropriate going forward as a strategy. And we also looked at the number of formally lodged requests or complaints. And alongside this, in some of the buildings, we had the on-site communication via posters informing people of the ongoing trial and the changes they might be experiencing. So I can only highlight a few of the findings, but the full report is publicly available. So if you're interested, you can read up a bit more about that. When we look at people's comfort levels and their behaviour on average, so across both of the study conditions, in the trial period in comparison to before, we interestingly find that there were no notable differences in building users' average self-reported thermal comfort levels before and during the trial period. So it indicates that the tested changes to the heating and cooling operation did not make occupants more uncomfortable. And you can see here on the right, the range of comfort. You can see it is quite a range, but around 2/3 of the occupants here in the middle were reporting acceptable comfort levels. So either saying they were comfortable or comfortably cold or comfortably warm. About 1/3 of respondents were saying that they were much too cold, much too warm, or too warm, but they were reporting this both before we made any changes to the HVAC control as well as during the trial period. Also, on average, there were no notable differences to how willing consumers were to accept those temperatures that they had experienced going forward. There were also no notable differences to the self-regulation behaviours. In fact, already at baseline, 82% of occupants were saying that they were already engaging in a range of behaviours to make sure that they would stay comfortable in the buildings. We did see a slight increase in formal complaints, so just a small number. Then we were interested in understanding the differences between the two different tested HVAC strategies. And what we found was that there was significant differences in the trends of comfort over time between the two different strategies. So the results suggested that building users that were in the one condition where we widened the dead bands to allow for greater fluctuations of temperature up to the 2 degree, they tended to experience greater discomfort over time. While users in the preheating condition, they tended to experience less discomfort over time. Now, in terms of the other aspects that we tested that make up user experience, we found no differences between the two strategies. So neither strategy was less likely to be accepted by users, more likely to impair work performance or result in informal complaints, or more likely to change self-regulation behaviours. Posters displayed on site were not a highly effective form of communication to the building occupants, and they created awareness around only 10% of respondents who reported that they had seen and read the poster. So what are the key things that we then need to consider when we want to engage people to support the development of microgrids? So here's a few recommendations that I want to share based on the field trials at Monash. So in this trial, we really pushed the temperatures a bit to the extreme because we were having temperatures rise for a longer period of time and to a greater degree than would happen or would be realistic under the operation of a microgrid, because we wanted to test the influence on user experience. And our findings therefore really support that these strategies going forward are an appropriate strategy and that they can be used across Monash to allow for more dynamic control during peak times and to maximize the benefits of the microgrid. And of course, we tested this in the setting of Monash campus, but it would be interesting to see if similar strategies could be equally successful elsewhere. In terms of which strategy is received better by building occupants, we found that actually both tested control strategies were appropriate, but a strategy using preheating or precooling may be slightly more appropriate than the widening of the dead bands. But this is really worth investigating further, as this was just one trial. And lastly, we don't think that an active or direct engagement with building occupants in the lead up to any changes to the control of heating and cooling is necessary. We actually think that it might increase the satisfaction and that users may not notice this anyways. And that's the result of this trial, but also of the earlier pilot that we had done. So we recommend to closely monitor temperature changes and any requests or complaints that might be coming in, especially in the early days of making changes, to be able to respond to them really quickly in a swift and effective manner, rather than proactively engaging with people up front. And if you do want to engage with people up front, then we would recommend a multi-channel approach in comparison to sort of a single approach as we did with the posters. Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Céline. That was great. So I'm going to ask all the panel to turn their cameras on. And we'll now go to questions. So please pop your questions into the Q&A. And alternatively, if you want to ask a question in person, you're welcome to do that as well. Just unmute your microphone or put your hand up using the raise hand function. So we've got the first question is for Céline. So the research that you conducted was in an environment which had established communication structures. And do you have any comment or thoughts on communication in a more general community setting?
That's a great question. Yeah, indeed, of course, conducting it in the context of Monash, which already has all these established structures in place, we wanted to work within those structures. And so actually we tested the posters because that is a common way of communicating with building users, especially in these sort of more public building settings and people that might be just coming in as visitors. But we could explore different processes of communicating. A general recommendation is a hard one because I actually believe that we need to really tailor the communication to whatever setting we're working with and we're working in. And so if you are in a setting, for example, where you have direct email addresses or contacts with people, a more direct form of communication might actually be much more effective. But maybe we can refer to some of the interesting findings from the research studies that we looked at, which came from examples of these microgrids that were community microgrids, these islanded remote settings. And what they actually did in one study where they're in the Maldives was that they brought the community together and they had a conversation around what the microgrid means and what the constraints are and how it is important for everybody to participate. And then they agreed on a set of signals that they were going to be sharing via text messages with key members in the community, and they would then circulate that on to other members. And that in this study proved to be a successful strategy. So that's one way. If you have a community setting, maybe you can bring people together and agree on these strategies up front together and get the buy-in. If you're in a commercial setting, maybe you also need to somehow generate this buy-in from the customers in the first place so that you then communicate to them and they respond to those signals that they know how to decode and they know what they need to do in response.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So, and this is kind of touching a little bit on that. So to Craig, this is a question from Craig, you mentioned, or you had in your slide there, that stakeholders may slow the decision-making processes. Your thoughts on how we can best manage to prevent this happening?
Well, I think Monash's initiative is one way to help communities, developers, industry. All I've done is work in the energy sector and I still don't understand it all. So, I think it's complex and I think there's an inherent distrust in the sector, suppliers, and other things. And I think that's what delays people in understanding, well, I think they can make the decision about putting solar on their roof, but making the decision around how do I get an integrated control system and do some of the things that Céline was talking about is a degree of difficulty far beyond your typical consumer, even the more sophisticated kind of commercial industrial consumers. So, I mean, my suggestion for those on the journey is reach out to Scott or reach out to partners that can help you on that journey, because there's, as the process that Scott put up, I think there's a lot of steps before you actually say, okay, I'm going to now develop a microgrid. And what we identified through some of the work was demand flexibility in network tariffs can have a big influencing factor on how flexible your energy decisions and infrastructure is in how you might be able to extract one of those value chains, let alone all the value chains that may be available in a microgrid. So, yeah, I know it's a long way to answer it, but I think, for those that are entering on this journey, they should seek help because it is complex.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to the questions here. Another one for Céline. Can you please elaborate on how self-regulation behaviour contributes towards optimal energy use? And what are the key parameters to better predict the energy use in this case, as the comfort level can be different for different people? It's a complex one.
That's a really good question. The self-regulation behaviours are interesting because I guess you can create the comfort in different ways. You can try to have an ambient air temperature that's perfect for everyone and at all times. But if people were happy to engage in these self-regulation activities, so putting on an extra layer of clothing or choosing lighter clothing on a day when it's a particularly hot summer day, and they felt that they could do that because everything around them was enabling that, then we wouldn't have to regulate the temperatures as much with energy use to create an environment and an air temperature that was really perfect for everyone. So we could allow for greater fluctuations in the temperatures because people were taking these activities to make sure that they still stayed comfortable, and that would then allow for greater flexibility in the system. But that's one example. I guess the clothing, other examples that people mentioned were doing things like just going for a walk when it was extremely hot just to cool off a little bit, or having ice cold drinks, and those kind of typically quite small things, but that can actually make a difference because it does allow for the greater fluctuations. The second question on what are the parameters that would predict it, really important things in terms of comfort are certainly gender and also the type of activity level or activeness within the building. So Monash, it's a big place organization with a lot of different types of buildings. So we also have sports facilities where we expect people to be very active. So we did actually consider that also in our study to looking at these activity levels and also gender differences and other factors that are influencing how comfortable people were.
Great, thank you. This is one for Scott and for Craig. You say there's no clear definition for a microgrid. Is the definition for a microgrid likely? And it seems strange there is not a clear definition yet.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's one where microgrids are relatively broad technology, and they're, while you said in the intro they've been around for a long time, they're evolving as the technology evolves as well. So is there going to be a definition? We've been doing a lot of work through this project to help provide a definition and feed that into some of the regulatory reform work that 𝗗𝗲𝗿𝗀's doing. They're doing a review of their rules around embedded networks at the moment, and they're looking at having a local energy system where we're trying to help them work in a definition of a microgrid in that space. So it may be coming. I think there's another question in there focused on what are the key barriers to microgrid uptake. Regulation is the biggest barrier because these are complex systems that are governed by multiple regulations or in the shadow of multiple regulations. And so it takes a lot of time to work through those different regulations, can also prevent a lot of access to the different value streams which are required to get these systems off the ground as well. Craig might be able to comment in terms of the different reform processes that are going on at the federal level, but reform takes a long time too. So is it going to be soon? You'd hope so. How long will it take? A little while.
Sorry, did Craig?
I was going to build on that. I think we've tied ourselves in knots by a disaggregated regulatory framework that thinks that there's generators separated from networks, separated from retailers, but a microgrid is a vertically integrated supply solution, and therefore we get around that by giving license exemptions for generation, network, and retail, but we don't actually acknowledge that there is a vertically integrated solution provider out there called microgrids, and that means the barrier to entry is multiple network license and retail license exemptions, and kind of navigating around this fragmented, disaggregated regulatory framework. So it's great to see Victoria taking some steps here in regards to acknowledging it is an active part of the energy system, but I think we're still a long way off.
Thank you. This is another one for Céline. Was there variation in reactions and comfort depending on locations within buildings? So, for example, near a big window, or east, west, or north-facing location?
I think it's another really great question, and I would absolutely love to be able to answer that question, because we had discussed this in the earlier stages of designing this trial, that it would be really interesting to understand that, are people near windows, is that areas that are quite drafty, and really look at it at that level of detail. And I do think that it would have an influence. I'm actually quite convinced of it, but with the methods that we had and how we were asking people about their comfort, they would have to be able to remember exactly, where they were in the building at what time in the day and how they felt at that time. And so it just wasn't possible to ask them at that level of detail how comfortable they were. So we asked them really more general, in that particular room or in that particular building, how comfortable were you? But it's a really great question, and I'm sure it would make a difference.
Okay, and just another one for you is, do you have a control group to assess the difference between physical and psychological comfort of occupants? Did we have a control group?
Another great one that we also had discussed in the early stages of the design, that would have been good to have a control group as well. So having a control group and a pre and post measure, which is what we did. We decided for the pre and post measure in the end, so that way we could consider the baseline, and then that has a similar effect to using a control group, in the sense that you can consider that there are already existing differences between buildings before we even made any changes, and then sort of use the treatment. And then you can look at the results in comparison to that earlier baseline. But a control group would have been, also great in addition to this, but we didn't have one.
This one I think is probably for Scott. Do you think it would be worth looking at whether you might offer better comfort by improving building fabric, so insulation and air tightness, when compared to providing more or less air conditioning and heating? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's been a few comments in there around this one, and I guess yes. So we've obviously got a program where we're looking at retrofitting buildings, and then also making sure new buildings we're building have really high thermal performance built into them as well. So a number of the buildings that were on the study that Céline talked to, they're pretty diverse. So we've got old buildings which have terrible thermal performance that we're working through to upgrade, and then we've got brand new buildings which are to passive house standards as well. Through this study, we didn't go down to the granular level of the building's performance and the different HVAC technologies which were in there, and assess that. It was really understanding, with what we've got and what we're working with, what's the flexibility we can get, so either reducing demand or increasing demand at times, or shifting demand around, and then what can we do within the occupants' comfort levels as well. But yeah, definitely agree. If we think about what we want to do here is get that greatest flexibility in our demand, and if we think about heating and cooling within buildings, then a building with a high thermal performance, it can retain its current temperature when you turn the systems on and off. There's comments in there around using water rather than traditional HVAC systems. One of the buildings, the New Horizons building, actually has in-slab heating, hydronic heating in its basement as well. But again, we didn't drill into that detail. And we're currently looking at district heating and cooling for our campus as well, because we totally appreciate that. We're also trying to electrify. So we're shifting away from natural gas, which we utilise to, we've got a big high pressure hot water loop, which is incredibly inefficient and has emissions baked into it. So we're looking at how can we shift in that space. So I guess this is where a microgrid, think of it as a control system that allows you to integrate all these different technologies and can help you to solve some of these things. And you're trying to do trade-offs as well. So you're trying to look at all these different things. But really the lens we're trying to take is we run a university as other people run businesses. Energy isn't the primary concern. It's what you do as your primary business, which for us is research and education. So understanding how people use those buildings, there's no point in having those buildings if they're uncomfortable and people can't go into them as well. So trying to figure out those trade-offs and factor in humans, if you think of a microgrid, is a battery with people on the inside. So it gets inherently more complex as well.
Thanks, Scott. We've got a question about how the research was funded. Can you talk to funding for that?
Yeah, sure. So I guess this project's got three different angles to it. So obviously Monash is committed to its net zero transition. So it's committed $135 million out to 2030 to transition our operations. And so that's the electrification, efficiency, renewables, but it's also this control piece in terms of the microgrid. We've received funding through ARENA in partnership with Indra to develop and deploy the microgrid control technology. And then we've received funding through the Victorian government through the Microgrid Demonstration Initiative, which has been looking around these commercial models and how do you actually operate a microgrid as well. So this toolbox itself has been developed out of the learnings through the Microgrid Demonstration Initiative.
Okay, excellent. I just want to...
Quick question there, it says which department? So that's through Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning.
Okay, I just want to back right up to the very beginning to your presentation. So the question is, if you were just starting out on this journey, what would be the first thing that you would do, Scott?
Yeah, so if we had a time machine and we could go back in time. So I guess obviously the first bit is understanding why you're doing this. So what role does it play? We had some innovative people being in a university who were forward thinking, who said, this stuff is emerging, we need to get on it and start to understand what role it is, but really understanding what are the drivers for either your community or your business will help inform whether this solution is right for you. There's a lot of effort that needs to go into figuring this out. So if you can screen in the first instance and realise that this sort of solution isn't fit for purpose and maybe simple solar or batteries or something more simple is right for you, then go down that pathway. But really understanding what's required is and what you're trying to do is key. The next one really is around the data. So these systems are driven off data, and getting access to that data and having your data structured is really key. And that gets more complex the bigger you are as a community or a precinct and the more stakeholders you've got involved. So figure out what it is you want to do a screen and assessment of are these right for you, and then get your data sorted and you're away.
Okay, and which is kind of an extension on that. So if you were designing a new precinct with mixed uses, like Arden Precinct, for example, what would you design a microgrid to do? That's for you, Scott.
That's for me. All right. And maybe happy for Craig to chip in on this one too. So I guess with a new precinct, if you're talking greenfield development, you can start to consider a microgrid to be able to control your energy demand, so you can reduce the build out costs for your energy infrastructure as well. And then you can also think of it of if your precinct has net zero goals and ambitions, which I assume is a state government funded precinct, you're trying to achieve net zero at some stage, how you can go about cost effectively getting to those targets and integrating the on-site and the off-site renewables balance. And then all those different bits and pieces that we spoke about with the technology, particularly in buildings, which are what predominantly make up a precinct as well. I might throw to Craig on this one. He might have some thoughts.
I think, Scott, you covered it, but I think investing the time up front to, as you said, Scott, to define what you want to achieve. Net zero, economic savings on energy costs aren't necessarily the same thing, or definitely aren't the same thing. So understanding and planning the upfront kind of what you're trying to achieve is critical, and thinking about that in the context of a journey rather than, we need to get to net zero tomorrow, because many of the more integrated microgrids are going to participate in the energy market. They might be in demand side markets, they might be in FCAS, and they might participate and respond to wholesale market signals. So that complexity obviously, comes with more sophistication in control systems and possibly more infrastructure investment in more batteries or more HVAC control systems and those types of things. So I think, the implementation steps that Scott's presented, I think it's so important to get those upfront ones done well, because once you bake that into a site, it's very hard to retrofit.
Okay, we've got time for one quick question, and this may be for Craig or Scott. Thoughts on hydrogen in the mix of microgrids?
Go, Craig, if you want.
Well, I think hydrogen, is a potential blending fuel for natural gas over time. It's a potential transition of gas infrastructure to hydrogen over time. Victoria, is cold in winter and needs heating, and a lot of its heating loads are dependent on the natural gas infrastructure. So hydrogen is a potential fuel of choice there. Similarly, in vehicle infrastructure, it's a potential fuel source for long-haul vehicles and buses and heavy vehicle infrastructure as well.
Yeah, we did a concept study looking at end uses for hydrogen and integration within the campus and into the microgrid, and that was around as a way to electrify by hydrogen our gas boilers, our current gas boilers. We also looked for use in waste trucks and buses, and then as a storage, and then feeding back into our microgrid as well. Commercially, doesn't stack up now, and so it's got a little bit to run to compete against the other technologies which are playing in this space. So again, it's a technology solution. You should adopt it if it's the most cost-effective one for you and that addresses those needs. And in a microgrid context, it is really about that shifting to 100% renewables push. So shifting away from natural gas and electrification, and then that storage piece as well. So you can do stuff through batteries, you can do stuff through demand response within your buildings as well. You could use hydrogen at the moment. It's not cost competitive in an urban setting like ours. Might be different somewhere else.
Thank you. Now we're at time, so I'm going to stop our questions there. I want to thank the panel, Scott, Craig and Céline, for your fabulous presentations. And thank you to the participants for engaging and asking some fantastic questions. As reminded, the webinar will be available on our website. Feel free to access the Microgrid Toolbox, which is also on our website. Links have been attached in the chat, and as well as exploring Céline's research report. So thank you everyone for your participation today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, everyone.